for the gifts that we have to give, and for this community, which truly seeks to live out its covenant of love and service. May we be grateful. We are celebrating Black History Month this month at UUI in our services and in our religious exploration program. The children today are going to be learning about and celebrating some brilliant Black inventors who have enriched American history. And you and I are going to be talking about some harder things, including about how so much of the product of Black people's brilliance and ingenuity and creativity was stolen away from them on these shores. So I want to begin today's sermon with a quote I saw online by an African-American journalist, Desiree Cooper, who said, "Slavery is white history. How we survived slavery is Black history." Which is to say, I want to apologize in advance for injecting so much white history into Black History Month today. The next two Sundays will be different, but today we're going to talk about some hard things. Enslavement reigned for 250 years on these shores, said author Ta-Nehisi Coates. When it ended, this country could have extended its hallowed principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all, regardless of color. But America, he notes, had other principles in mind. In 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates published a groundbreaking essay in the Atlantic Monthly magazine called The Case for Reparations, which brought fresh life to a conversation that has proceeded fitfully and haltingly throughout the 150 years of post-slavery America, raising a question that has most often been ignored by white people since the failure of Reconstruction, a question associated with the far fringes of political life, with radicals, zealots, impractical dreamers, a question rarely asked except to immediately dismiss or mock it. But the question is, what does America owe Black people, and what would it mean to pay that debt? Now, I grew up in the liberal tradition, and I was taught the generally accepted liberal understanding of America's racial history, which goes something like this. For a long time, there was slavery, and that was terrible, but we fought a war to end it. Then there was Jim Crow in the South, which was also terrible, and Jim Crow was characterized by unfair and unequal treatment. Right? The images that I saw in school books and history classes growing up that defined Jim Crow and post-slavery American racism for me were images like separate water fountains for white people and Black people, or Black people being denied service at lunch counters, or Black people being denied the right to vote. They were images of unequal treatment. And so the remedy, as I understood it, was to stop the unequal treatment. And so we had laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and later the Fair Housing Act that were supposed to end this unequal treatment. And so in my mind, that equated to a remedy to the problem. So one of the things that I found very powerful about Coates' article, which is available online, and I would recommend highly that everyone read it, is how he reframes the history of American racism from one of unequal treatment of Black people to one of theft from Black people and from the Black community. And for me personally, that changed my understanding of the problem, because if someone is treating you unequally for 100 years, you might imagine that if they say, okay, I'm going to treat you equally from now on, that addresses the issue. But if someone has been stealing from you for 100 years, then okay, I will stop stealing from you, leaves room for some important follow-up questions like, where did that money go exactly? And how are you going to pay me back? Even the history of slavery, I was taught to think of as primarily a moral crime, a crime against the humanity of Black people, which of course it was, the most horrible crime imaginable. But it was also an economic crime, right? Slavery was theft, outright theft, the theft of Black labor, and it was theft that to a large degree built this country. As Ta-Nehisi Coates testified to Congress on Juneteenth in 2019 on the subject of reparations, in 1836, almost half of the economic activity in the United States derived directly or indirectly by the cotton produced from the million-odd slaves. Half of the economic activity in this country. By the time the enslaved were emancipated, they constituted the largest single asset in America, more than all other assets combined. So 250 years of black labor and wealth creation was simply stolen from black people, and the wealth went directly into the pockets of white people and indirectly to their ancestors. And it went into the endowments of churches and universities and other civic institutions, and it went into the coffers of state and local governments and the federal government. After the Civil War, formerly enslaved people were promised land as reparations, the famous 40 acres and a mule. The promise was nullified in 1865 by Andrew Jackson, right? They never got it. In the end, the only Americans who got reparations for slavery were 1,000 former slave owners in Washington, D.C., who were paid reparations by Abraham Lincoln for their loss when slavery was abolished in that territory in 1862. The formerly enslaved in the South never got any compensation for their stolen labor. What they got was the reimposition of a quasi-slave existence under Jim Crow, in which black people were reduced to sharecropping and subject to widespread theft of their production with no legal recourse, under the constant threat of violence. Black people who refused to work under exploitive conditions could be arrested for so-called vagrancy and brought into the incredibly brutal convict lease system, where they were once again treated as free labor to be exploited. Where did this stolen wealth go? Now, opponents of reparations often say that slavery was a long time ago, 150 years ago. When they're reminded that Jim Crow lasted 100 years after slavery, they say, well, that was a Southern thing. So it's important to note that Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his article, The Case for Reparations, does not begin his case with slavery, and he does not begin in the South with Jim Crow. Coates begins his 2014 article in Chicago in 1961. That was a year that an African-American man named Clyde Ross bought a house on contract in the neighborhood of North Lawndale. Clyde Ross was born in 1923 in Mississippi. As a child, Mr. Ross saw his parents forced into sharecropping when their land and assets were stolen to pay a spurious tax bill that they had no legal ability to contest. He saw how black people in the South endured routine humiliations, how everything they created was taken from them, how they lived under the ever-present threat of violence. Don't complain, his father would tell him, or we could be killed. Mr. Ross escaped Mississippi by enrolling in the Army and serving his country in World War II. And after the war, he resettled up north in Chicago, and at first, he was astounded. He really thought he had found freedom and dignity and the equal protection of the law, which was all that he wanted. He'd served his country. He'd found a decent job. He was married. And the next step was to buy a house. Only Mr. Ross didn't have access to a mortgage the way other people in his economic position did, because a variety of federal policies, FHA policies, and local redlining practices kept home mortgages away from black people. Mr. Ross was a veteran, but the GI Bill would not help him. And in fact, the vast majority of black GIs were simply denied mortgages. There's a 2019 article by journalist Aaron Blakemore called How the GI Bill's Promise Was Denied to 1 Million Black World War II Veterans. She notes that in 1947, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA-guaranteed home loans in Mississippi went to black borrowers. In New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill went to black people. Blakemore continues, nearly 8 million World War II veterans received education or training, and 4.3 million home loans worth $33 billion had been handed out, but most black veterans had been left behind. There was no greater instrument, she concludes, for widening an already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. And again, This was not individual prejudice, this was policy. So denied the option of a mortgage, Mr. Ross was able to buy a house on contract. This was the only option he had. And this was a predatory setup in which he had full responsibility for the home, just as though he were an owner, all of the repairs, the insurance, the taxes. But he was not a homeowner. He had to make monthly payments, but he acquired no equity with any of those payments, as if he were a renter. And if he missed a single payment before the entire balance of the loan was paid, the contract holder could and would foreclose on the spot, and Mr. Ross would lose everything that he had paid. Contract leasing was a big business in Chicago. It was not unusual for contract sellers to sell and resell the same home 4 or more times under this system, using every dirty trick they could think of to create unexpected expenses for the homeowner, tell them the house is up to code when it was not, and then when the inspector comes, they're stuck with a sudden bill. And if they can't pay it, then they can foreclose, capture the wealth, sell it to someone else. It is estimated that 85% of black homeowners in Chicago were under contract during this time. The system was designed to drain wealth out of the black community and into unscrupulous white pockets, impoverishing black families in the process. Mr. Ross himself worked 3 jobs to keep from losing his home. His wife worked as well. As a result of this schedule, he had to pull his kids out of the good private school they were attending and put them in a substandard local public school. So his children's opportunities were also diminished. Today, at age 91, Mr. Ross still owns his home. But North Lawndale, where this economic predation happened, is, to use Mr. Coates' words, a ghetto, depopulated and on the wrong end of every conceivable social metric: poverty, crime, infant mortality, hunger, incarceration. Having been enslaved for 250 years, Coates writes, black people were not left to their own devices. They were terrorized. In the Deep South, a second slavery ruled. In the North, legislators, mayors, civic associations, banks, and citizens all colluded to pin black people into ghettos where they were overcrowded, overcharged, and undereducated. The notion, he concludes, that black lives, black bodies, and black wealth were rightful targets remained deeply rooted in the broader society. So these are the consequences of that history. Despite progress in lowering the rate of black poverty, the income gap between black and white households is roughly the same today as it was in 1970. We have made no progress. The Pew Research Center estimates that white households are worth roughly 20 times as much as black households. Patrick Sharkey, a sociologist at New York University, studied children born from 1955 through 1970 and found that 4% of white people and 62% of black people across America had been raised in poor neighborhoods. 4% of white people, 62% of black people. That was 1955 through 1970. A generation later, the same study showed virtually nothing had changed. Black people and white people inhabit such different neighborhoods, Sharkey concludes, it is not possible to compare the economic outcomes of black and white children. Now, I'm going to detour just very quickly through a piece of local history because I want to tie this to Indianapolis. Once upon a time, there was a thriving black arts and business district in Indianapolis along Indiana Avenue. In the 30s and 40s, Indiana Avenue had a distinctive local jazz scene that was nationally famous. It attracted jazz greats from all around the country. Madam C.J. Walker had her factory here. She built her multipurpose arts center. It was a thriving, vibrant, stressed, poor community. But as the population grew, and the banks and the redliners kept mortgage funds out of the neighborhood, and they kept investment money out that would improve homes, well, there was no ability to build new homes. There was no ability to improve the existing homes, and so more and more people were forced into increasingly degraded housing. Meanwhile, local police began harassing clubs that catered to white patrons. They were determined to enforce segregation along the avenue, and that drove white money out of the business district. So the resulting poverty in the neighborhoods around Indiana Avenue became a justification for eminent domain. It was called slum reclamation. And so entire black neighborhoods were seized and demolished to put in the interstate, to build the expanding IUPUI campus. More and more neighborhoods were destroyed. In just a few decades, a thriving black community was wrecked, its inhabitants forcibly relocated. Today, you would never know it had been there. I commend to you an article called The Ethnic Cleansing of Indianapolis by Wildstyle Pascal, which is available at newamerica.org. It is worth your attention. So in 1989, Representative John Conyers first introduced into the House Bill H.R. 40, a bill to create a commission to study the question of reparations owed to black people. It was not heard. And then every year after that, until his retirement in 2017, every year for almost 30 years, Representative Conyers reintroduced H.R. 40 into the House, and it was never heard. And then last year, on Juneteenth of 2019, H.R. 40 was reintroduced by Sheila Jackson Lee, and it finally got a hearing in a subcommittee to a packed House and overflow rooms. And I think it is safe to say that this is in no small part due to Coates's elevation of the question of reparations in the national consciousness. Today, many of the Democratic candidates are in favor of at least studying this issue, of talking about this issue, and I dare say no one would be talking about it if it were not for Coates. Now, reparations is a divisive issue. 3/4 of black people are in favor of reparations. 85% of white people are opposed to reparations. What might it look like? Well, probably not a direct cash payment. Some reparations advocates talk about something more like a Marshall Plan for the black community, maybe built out of interest-free loans, college tuition, support for local businesses, like a big sustained push to close the wealth gap between the white and black communities, representing all of those decades and generations of theft. Locally, some institutions are beginning to investigate their own histories and make their own decisions about what is owed and what is just. Like Georgetown University and Princeton Seminary are two examples of schools that have examined their historical profiting from slavery and taken steps to return wealth, either to direct descendants or to the larger black community. And they're not alone in these efforts. And so it's easy to immediately get bogged down in details when you're talking about reparations, because it's such a huge idea. So it's easy to immediately get technical and intellectual and raise objections and problems and make the whole subject seem so impossible that it's not worth seriously discussing. But the question at root is, what does America owe black people, and what would it mean to pay that debt? To me, the way that white America ignores the fullness of its history, ignores the consequences of 400 years of continuous theft, sometimes in the form of denial of benefits, sometimes from outright appropriation, today through mass incarceration, and today the prison industrial complex finances entire white communities. The way America ignores this very recent, very real legacy of theft, and then says things like, slavery was 150 years ago, why aren't you over it yet? This is nothing less than the gaslighting of the black psyche on a national scale. America has stolen relentlessly from the black community. That's just our history. And then America turns around and blames black people for their poverty. What has been taken from the black community? What is owed? Just asking the question, just having the conversation in a serious way is an important step. So to open the question of reparations is to begin a difficult, contentious, painful conversation, but I also believe that it is necessary. because America has never had a truth and reconciliation process, and it is long overdue. Ta-Nehisi Coates calls reparations the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. What is needed, he writes, is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. He says, what I'm talking about is more than a recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, more than a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about, he says, is a national reckoning that would lead to a spiritual renewal. He concludes, more important than any single check cut out to any African American, the payment of reparations would represent America's maturation out of the childhood myth of its innocence into a wisdom worthy of its founders. Our second Unitarian Universalist principle commits us to work for justice and equity for all people. I invite you to consider what justice means in the context of America's long history of white supremacy, its long history of racialized theft. In the absence of easy answers, may we all be open to hearing the question, understanding that the question itself carries with it the lived experience of 400 years of the black community. For those of us who are not black, let us receive the question as an invitation into soul-searching and education. And for all of us collectively, it is an invitation into national repentance, a long overdue reckoning with the story of who we are. So before we rush to answer that question, let our hearts be opened and let us truly, truly hear. Amen, and blessed be.